So that allows us to move on to the next session, which is effectively asking the questions where these guys have had the benefit of talking individually. Now we're going to pitch them against each other to see what happens. So this should be a fascinating, interesting, hopefully enjoyable, experiential debate. Okay, I should join them now. Our first question comes from Professor Terry Stevens. If you could...
Thank you, Ray. There's some that would believe that Britain is a global leader in attracting and engaging domestic and international audiences, creating compelling places and staging extraordinary experiences, just as Eric has described. However, is this a rose-tinted view of how good we are? Are we in any way uniquely gifted? If we are, what are the conditions that allow that to happen? Or are we just agonizingly egotistical, thinking we're that good?
Right. Well, maybe I'm going to start with Martin as one of our guests to our nation.
That's me. Gosh, it's complicated. No, I don't think that's just a positive view. I mean, the potentials are made. The way the UK is connected all over the world, it's networking inside the country, it's networking outside the country. I mean, the creative industry, it looks like it's an idea of the last 20 years. I mean, it's not true. All those art schools that started, I mean, in the 60s, but if you think about the Royal College of Art that went before 170 years around, is that working? So, you know, it's a very long movement, very deeply rooted in society. So that's one part of it, and I think it's extremely reliable for the future. The other part, put some water into the wine. I think what we all miss, meanwhile, is that part that's called technology or maybe engineering. I think we all talk about that beautiful skin that we call design, and we miss, meanwhile, that we need a beautiful skeleton, or at least bones, behind that. And that country has an amazing treasure of knowledge in terms of engineering. And to add not only the ethics to the aesthetics, but also the engineering, the technology part, I think this is something for the future.
Juliana.
I think that Britain, we're celebrating Britain, so let's say it's good, because I think we have got a lot to be proud of. I think a lot has come with our empire and our nature of collecting things from others that has allowed us to have a head start in this industry. That's about as delicately as I can put it. However, I think there's a huge danger in Britain believing that it can remain ahead of the game, and these discussions that we're having and our willingness to share with others means that very soon the rest of the world will catch up with their own true identities and how interesting they are for others and how easy it is to tell a good story, present it well, and attract people to come and listen to you. So we're the best at the moment, and I sound like Boris Johnson now, don't I? We're the best at the moment, but watch out, because we're sharing it with everybody. So we're going to have to get better.
Miranda.
Gosh, I'm going to not disagree with you, but say I think we, in this international age, we actually all feed off each other. And certainly in the community that I work in, we're very much global. Certainly we have a lot of European meetings. One of the best zoo experiences at the moment is actually in Leipzig Zoo in Germany. And in Guadana land, which everyone is very jealous of at the moment. And I think by having meetings such as this, by feeding off each other's experiences, by learning from other attractions that aren't just zoos, that we are improving what we are doing. We're improving the experience for the public, and we're improving the experience for the animals as well, which is very important. But it's feeding off each other, and no, I wouldn't say Britain was leading the way, but we're very much part of the team that is.
Okay, before I come to Eric, Bob, did you have a comment, especially in technology?
I made the comment that very early on in my career, we realized unless we could work internationally, we simply wouldn't know what was going on, and we would be overrun very easily. And one can't help pointing out that a lot of the huge talent we have in this country is in fact not necessarily first-generation immigrant, but certainly immigrant stock. And that has been the success of Britain in attracting people from all over the world. And the point was well made this morning that this was the case. And the point was also made this morning that we need to ensure we keep the conditions that allow that melting pot to continue. Because if we suddenly get all exclusive about it, that's where we'll get into trouble. I think that's what Juliana was referring to. That we can't be complacent, but we can, if we really apply ourselves to it, we can enjoy the ride. There are a lot of opportunities, and we can make a big contribution.
Eric?
One of the great things when you're dealing with heads of state is that they always have a lot of questions. And those questions always begin about 2 o'clock in the morning. So they always say, what do you think about our culture? And I always say, why are you forsaking the genius of your own culture? And they say, well, you live in the United Kingdom, you're American. I mean, we want what you have. And I said, look, it's really basic. Let's take the United Kingdom and the British culture, right? They brought to the world, right, double entry accounting, healthcare, right? The concept of risk-free capitals, protecting new capital, and obviously education systems. But they also brought to it a sense of respect for the diversity of the world's cultures. I mean, the museums in this city alone are filled with such a profound diversity of accomplishment from around the world. And I said, until you begin to teach your citizenry, your electorate, how to respect the diversity of cultures, not use religion as a weapon, not use your difference as a way to disparage others, until you respect and understand the tolerance of diversity of the world's societies, you're never going to be a world leader. And so all the things that all of the colleagues up here have talked about the greatness about the museums in the United Kingdom, all come from a fundamental thought process, which is the world is to be understood. And we, because we've collected these, bring that understanding to the world. And to each of these heads of state, I say the same thing. Build a place that teaches the world about the genius of your own culture, but more importantly, teaches your children about the genius of the world.
Okay, our second question comes from Mary Fisher. Please, over there.
Thank you. Yes, mine's about zoos and aquariums. Zoos, aquariums and botanic gardens in the UK contribute significantly to the economy, to the public engagement, and increasingly to social cohesiveness, and also to environmental awareness. Could government do more to support this sector further and reap even greater social and economic benefits? And what other benefits can be gained from other attractions? What do they bring? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Miranda, I think this is in your sphere.
Well, I think we could get a lot more support. Some of the funds that are available to other sectors are not as easily accessible by zoos and aquariums. And I think part of it is possibly our own fault in that we haven't shouted loudly enough about what we do, but we're now starting to do that, and we are starting to engage more with government. And I think that the visitor attractions in Britain would benefit if there were more available funds that we could apply for to build exhibits, rather like the Gondwanaland in Leipzig, which I've just described, a lot of which was raised from external funds, which it's almost impossible at the moment for a British zoo to actually achieve.
Okay. Juliana?
I'm sure there's a question going to come up about the benefit of free museums versus those that are commercial and paid, so I might reserve my response to the funding until then. I think in really simple terms, parents, this is more of a personal answer than a business one, but parents and people with young children are busier and busier and busier, and we have less and less time to engage in educating our young people as parents and put more and more onus onto others to do that for us. And I think zoos, aquariums, museums and visitor attractions all play an increasing role in actually helping to educate young people, and that's possibly down to a time pressure of parents.
It's quite interesting actually, at the BIAZA conference, the parliamentary dinner, wasn't it? For the first time I heard ministers actually responding by saying that social cohesiveness could be one of the biggest benefits. And it's quite interesting, following last year's interesting situations in the summer, how that has suddenly come onto the agenda. And I certainly think that visitor attractions could play a really important role, regardless of whether they're zoos or aquariums.
And I would agree with that. The only thing I would say is that those phrases, social cohesiveness, whether you're English, Chinese, or whether the translation is into Urdu, it hides the real meaning of that, which is actually we've got a story to tell. We can help to educate, and all of us ought to be more involved as projects and attractions and museums in that. But don't use words like that.
Yeah. Eric, on the sort of more city scale.
We get asked to look at obviously the flora and fauna and turning those into botanical gardens and zoological gardens. The shift though is that and all the recent stuff on zoos is representative of this. Instead of being animals in cages, the human beings are put into the protected environments, and then the environments, you are surrounded by the environment as opposed to surrounding the environment. And that shift is a fundamental experience change, where instead of looking at an animal in this cage, you're actually in an African belt, and you're surrounded by herds of that particular type of animal. And the Botanic Gardens, the Eden project is the best example. Instead of seeing one specimen of a tree, you see hundreds, so that you can actually walk through the rainforest as a physical experience as opposed to looking at a precious object. It costs more money. It takes a huge investment in terms of operating capital to keep these things going, but it's the only way to import exotic landscapes and exotic creatures from elsewhere in the world and bring them in and really create an experience that will change the visitors' and guests' lives.
Martin?
Well, I think that a few institutions in our societies, they're a little bit like a mirror or like a palm where you're reading. And I think zoos and botanical gardens are pretty much the same. It says a lot about how we treat nature, how it's our perception, what's our changing understanding. I'm quite curious about that zoo in Leipzig, because that's what I said in the beginning, with reunification and reinventing institutions in a very difficult phase. And there was always a challenge, and there was always a potential. That's what I mean. The question is if it's, we have in our society, we have an amazing value, and that's all our collections. You mentioned that before. Those collections everywhere. It's not only the art pieces. Just go to the National History Museum. It's just amazing, that archive of humankind. And the question is, but I don't have the imagination or fantasy. If a zoo has to be still a protected area in a city or botanical garden, or if you open it to the city, don't worry, I don't want to have lions walking around in the city center. But anyhow, to a certain extent, I think there's a possibility to open it, like we used to open the museums in a certain way. If you ask me, give you some details, I don't have it. But I think that there's still this barrier in between the topic and the audience. And I think there's something that could be changed. But I'm definitely not an expert in that field.
Can I add just something? You mentioned the Natural History Museum. We had this conversation in February. We're doing a huge project in the Middle East, and they were saying, we want Natural History Museum folded in, and we want a zoo and all that stuff. I said, why are you dividing those two? Wouldn't it be really great, by the elephant part of the thing, is to have the skeleton, then the taxidermy that you could actually touch, and then the real things out there. Well, the squirming and the squeals that came out of that room, I can still have echoing in my head, because it's almost like, dead animals and live animals do not mix. But in fact, every kid, once they see one of those things moving, wants to know, how in the heck do they move? And so I believe we're going to someday convince someone to do a zoological and natural history museum where the dead and the live, I bet the animals would like to see what's going on inside them.
Okay, Bob, can we move on to the next question? Yeah, and because there's some special ones coming up for you later, okay, on technology. So if I move on to the next question, and that comes from Lizzie Moriarty from the British Museum.
Lizzie Moriarty, the British Museum, one of the many museums in the world, which is a museum of the world for the world. My question is about learning. Many attractions place great importance on learning opportunities, from learning outside the classroom being the important factor, making learning a fun experience, and evidence shows that young people learn more from these experiences rather than within the classroom. So my question is, should this medium be incorporated formally into education policy?
Well, thank you. Actually, you, Martin, again.
Yes, definitely. I mean, you do it already in the British Museum to a very high extent. And the V&A is the same, and all the other museums, not only the major ones, also smaller ones. I think meanwhile it's part of a curriculum wherever you go. But you're right. I think in terms of very early understanding of institutions, education and museums have to be, or collections, have to come together and find new ways of education. I mean, it's not only about a museum, about a school going to a museum. There's definitely much more that we can do. At the same time, I was a bit worried when you mentioned fun. I mean, I have to admit that I never really liked school, so it was much better to be outside in school and learn outside. But at the same time, we had that presentation of Paul Smith the other day in the V&A, and he has one slide, I have it on my iPhone somewhere, and he said, if you want to do it, you have to do it. And it means, I mean, learning and learning experience means also sitting in a classroom doing something, if you know what I mean. But then, I don't know if the fun part is the right one, it's more the experience part. And I mean, it's not only the museums, it's really the archives, the collections, the storage facilities that have this kind of living history, and I think we have to open those, not only for pupils, also for universities, for research. There's much more that we can do together.
Juliana.
Well, I think this continues from a point I was making earlier about the value, I think, that we can all bring to the education of our young children by opening our museums and embracing them and bringing them in. But I think it's got to be a little bit more than a fun experience. The fun experience and learning from fun has been a phrase that we've used for the last 20 years, perhaps. I always try to liken it more to the teachers that you had when you were educated, and you know the subjects that you excelled in were taught to you by teachers who were good, they were engaging, they told stories, and you were engaged. And quite often the subjects that you haven't, as individuals, excelled in were the ones where your teachers were boring. And I think our role is to be the great teacher, the inspiration for young people. So it's not, for me, just about fun. It's actually about engagement, storytelling, and inspiration.
Eric.
My mother was a teacher, and so we couldn't go to a museum unless we brought a sketchbook and a pen. And it was a fountain pen, by the way, not some Crayola crayon. And we weren't allowed to leave unless we had drawn a half a dozen of the things we saw. And so for me, to talk about education in the British Museum, one of the most extraordinary things in any museum in the UK is when you go into like the Tate and you see someone set up with an easel, a forger in the making, okay, copying one of these great masterpieces. And I would love to see a block of marble in the Elgin room and someone chipping away, showing kids that they too can carve stone and tell a story. Or where the Rosetta Stone is, etching in a huge block of basalt or slate, I don't know what it is, but how they would choose 3 separate languages to record what meant the most to them. I think education doesn't have to be a classroom. I think a museum, right, which was the house of the muses, right, needs to come alive again. And if we can do that and show kids that they too can create jewelry, spin pots, do tapestries, carve marble, that we can touch them in ways by engaging them as opposed to making them just consumers and spectators, that they too can think, hey, I can go out and do this too. And that's what education's about for me.
You wanted to come back on something, Martin?
No, because it's echoing in my mind what he's saying. Yes, sure. And I think it's more than education, and that's probably the point. It's more than engaging. I'm always surprised, and that's the reason I wanted to say it again. If we have a different audience in the V&A, I'm just talking about the V&A right now. If a different audience, if it's education, communities coming to the museum, guided tours, drawings, glasses or whatever it is, or if you just offer the space and the workshops and young people, kids come in for making. I have a small group of advisors between 14 and 18. They have their own business. They use the V&A for their business, if you understand what I mean, this kind of blogs and small brands and so on. I think it's more like using our facilities, our possibilities. I mean, what we have, for example, in a city like London is really luxury. We have space. We work together with a group in Brixton called Liberty, and they are young people building their own business, creating their own business. What they need is space. What they need is audience. So I think it's the collection and our engagement, but at the same time, I think we have to trust young people and offer all the other possibilities that we have in the museum.
Our industry was started from an old tradition of the cabinet of curiosities. And I think that's what we need as an industry to do, not perhaps to teach, not to offer fun, but just to incite curiosity again.
So Bob, technology, classroom, not the classroom.
Well, I have to say that I echo completely everything Juliana has said about this avoiding this word fun, but motivation, yes, absolutely. And and I'm sure that from I can even remember when I was a kid, that we didn't then have organised museum visits. They didn't really get off the ground in those days. But I remember going to the Science Museum and being absolutely captivated by some of the things I saw. They had a bit area down the basement where they had all sorts of gadgets you could work yourself, but they were very physical, and they didn't immediately explain what they were about. They were there for you to discover what they were about. And I think it's this area of discovery that we want to have in museums. And I don't know, I think there's a great problem about force-feeding people. That you get the school that says, oh, we've got to do the museum visit, so class 2B has got to go to the museum, and there's some right little tyke at the back that ruins the whole experience for everybody else. It really is, I think, got to be raised up. I don't think I think it's very dangerous to say the museum should become lesson 5 on Fridays. I think it must be made an experience, something you cannot do at home, cannot do at school. If you try and level it down to something that everybody does, I don't think it's so good.
And of course, Miranda, larger than life, zoos and safari parks and aquariums.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said, and I think the key is interaction. I mean, I can remember from my childhood that visits to museums could not sometimes were a little bit tedious. And now, of course, everything's changed and you have interaction and things are explained and you have more activities. And I don't actually have this same problem, I think, with the fun word, because I don't think it's necessarily a bad word. It means you've enjoyed yourself. And we've now started, thank goodness, to evaluate what we're doing. And so we're testing testing in the same, getting the impressions of what the children know when they arrive, and then getting the impressions through drawings and understanding of what they know afterwards. And we're seeing a very big difference. And I think that's the important thing. And I think we now know that it's not marching them around lecturing to them, it's getting them to interact and be creative while they're there, and then they remember more, and it makes a bigger and hopefully lasting impression.
Indeed. Okay, next question comes from Derek Johnson from DJPM.
Hello, good afternoon. Yes, Derek Johnson, Independent Project Manager. So my question, I think, is probably aimed for Juliana in the first instance, given it's about money or lack of money. Which is what have been the principal effects on the attraction sector since the introduction of free entry? And you know that Ray never likes one straightforward question, so there's a subset. That is that has it in your mind just created a greater accessibility, i.e. increased the numbers, or as somebody who's actually aligned to the Eden project, has it created an uneconomic playing field?
It's a question with many different answers, of course. And we've had situations where our museums, I think most of them, charged, but the commercial visitor attraction sector was not as developed as it is now. Now we have a mix of some institutions being free, whilst charging for other exhibitions. And the commercial sector has grown and is charging. Whatever answer you might have given, or I might have given 3 or 4 years ago, is now completely out of the water, because I think most commercial attractions are struggling within the current commercial climate. And I would say, as a visitor attraction, a group of 6 visitor attractions, all of which have a entry charge, it is difficult to see other doorways opened free of charge and funding go into the projects. Many are very, very worthwhile. The V&A and others, we all know which ones are very, very worthwhile. I think my discomfort is with those that would not commercially stand up and are being supported in an unrealistic way. I don't think it's as simple, therefore, as I'm selling fish and chips and somebody opens a fish and chip shop next door to me saying they're free. It's not as simple as that. But as a commercial operator, it makes it a more difficult trading market when you have a free offer nearby. And they're good offers as well.
Martin.
Only over my dead body, if I want to change it. It's, I think it's really something that is a great achievement for the public in general. And I remember, the British Museum for quite a long time had free entrance, no fee. And I remember, but anyhow, the first time when I came after, it was 10 years ago, when it was established, and I came to the British Museum, like quite often, you're on a business trip and you have an hour and you just bump into the museum. It was a different museum. It was a different audience. It was a different way to see the museum. Even, it's the way they changed completely, and I think that is so important. And I mean, for the V&A, we talk about creativity, we talk about inspire young people, we talk about, they wouldn't be there. Honestly, that's their chance just to walk into a museum. And what I always liked, there's the intellectual part of a museum, there's the collection, there's research, but there's just a part of a museum that is like a forum, that's part of a city. This is like you go there and you enjoy yourself. And that makes you, that's about curiosity, that's the way it starts. And people that just kids walking into the museum, sitting in the garden, and then very slow you go to the collection, you learn more about it. This kind of open space is part of a museum. And once we re-establish an entrance fee, that's gone.
Eric?
We're in a position now of working with some remarkable groups of people. So, for instance, we designed a national cathedral for Australia in Canberra that has a museum on the history of faith in Australia as part of it. The capital costs aren't the problem. And all of you that are in the museum business, the capital costs are okay. It's the operating capital that drives you crazy. So what we say to everybody, remember where I started my talk, leisure is the new infrastructure. If you want to have a cultural institution in your city or your country, you've got to endow the operating costs up front. You can't let it be left to donors that are dependent upon the crazy cycles of the economy, because they all dry up. You change the tax law in America and volunteer donations evaporate to these places. So we set up what's called the CivicArts Endowment Trust, and what it's based on is the commercial growth of everything around that museum or that leisure experience. And it's a 1% surcharge on every transaction of a lease or a sale that is then put into that facility. And in Australia, the numbers are very basic, okay? And why these things have to be open and should be free. And that is, for every person that spends time at a facility, they spend $99 per person per visit. So if you get 1 million people coming to a visit, that's $100 million that's being pumped into the economy. Leisure is the new infrastructure. It has to be supported by government up front, and the CivicArts Endowment Trust, which we put in place on each of our projects, takes it off the tax roll because it shows that the halo of development that benefits by those cultural, leisure, and entertainment facilities throws money into that trust and can sustain it in perpetuity.
Miranda?
I think the problem for us is that it has created greater accessibility to some institutions like the Natural History Museum and the V&A, which obviously is a very good thing, but there is now an asymmetric playing field. And when we have a recession like we have at the moment, where people are counting their pennies, they're obviously going to go more to the free attractions than the ones which are significantly more expensive. And I think another problem is that the zoos, even the charitable zoos in this country, don't get any subsidy at all, whereas in most of the European countries, certainly the main city zoos do get some subsidy from the cities. And so the British zoos are therefore relatively expensive, and when there is an economic downturn, it is a noticeably expensive day out, especially for a family. So I think it is an important issue, and one which does need to be looked at more carefully than perhaps it has been so far.
Bob, do you have a point of view on that?
I don't think I've got much to add, because I think the main points have already been made. I think that I can hear where Juliana is coming from, because, of course, you can get, some national trust properties and things like that are free now, are they? Do they represent competition to you or not?
No, I think there's another factor that's affecting the British visitor attraction and heritage sector at the moment, which is the national trustisation of visits, which is that people will buy one ticket and then use it as if it were free around other locations.
Right.
So there's that factor as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's really what I was thinking about. I mean, I can see a case for, much as Eric was saying, that for iconic city centre museums, I think there's a very good argument for free entry. I can see that when you get further out, that people give, you know, where you are looking to develop regular visits all around the country, we all would have a vested interest in actually getting the more attractions with a more even price, rather than having this situation at the moment where people can choose to go for the free one, which is artificial because you're paying it for some other way, or it's being paid for by some other method. And we have to forget, we must never forget that, I mean, going back to your earlier question about, you know, what should government do? Hang on a minute. Government is spending our money, and therefore we want to be sure that any mechanism that's put in this way really wouldn't be better served by saying, well, let people do it themselves and let's not tax them in the first place. So, you know, one possibly helpful thing would be to say, attractions could have less VAT or something like that. And that might be a much bigger stimulus than the irritant of the odd attraction not having a charge.
I think raising the VAT issue at this point, when we might have a minister in the room, is a very good point to make.
Good.
Moving swiftly on.
Well, I'm sufficiently ignorant of the business. I'm the only person allowed to make these sort of remarks.
Okay, now we've covered a lot of things there you could think of the domestic, but obviously we can offer these experiences ourselves abroad. So the next question actually touches upon a note I got recently from Robin Clutterbuck, but the question will come from Martin Best.
Thank you. Martin Best, Cultural Innovations. With the tradition, expertise, global reach and wealth of intellectual property assets, are UK institutions, operators, designers, fabricators and installers maximising the UK's potential to collaborate in overseas markets to mutual benefit and to benefit of clients?
Eric, how do we kick this one off?
Okay, let's see here. I think it's interesting using UK institutions globally. We're working in Abu Dhabi now, and we've been brought in to build a town center that connects the Louvre, the Guggenheim, and the Zayed National Museum, which I think is working with the British Museum. Their projected attendance is roughly 2.5 to 3 million people. We're going to build a town center that's going to bring 33 million people, 11 times the attendance. But that town center would have nothing to it as a brand without the cultural institutions that are coming from France and from the United Kingdom and from America. So the other example we have is that we're designing now a Buddhist pilgrimage destination in Nepal that's being funded by the Chinese as a goodwill gesture to the Nepalese. And so what you see increasingly, and possibly beginning first with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, is the use of cultural institutions, leisure, entertainment, and cultural institutions as calling cards in diplomacy, as calling cards to lift the entire economy of countries that are less developed than we are, and yet crave to have access to the cultural knowledge base that we take for granted. And so in our world, we seed every one of our projects around the world with the best and the brightest that comes from the United Kingdom and America to basically teach these other cultures that are desperate for world recognition how to mine the archaeology of their own past and bring that up to teach the world. And you can do that by example only. And so for us, we believe, in fact, that the diplomatic parcel of UK, the United Kingdom's cultural institutions are in fact the grandest calling card you can ever deliver.
Now, Martin, Dundee. Now, in a couple of years, if Alex Salmon has his way, that'll be an overseas market. So, what's your response to that question?
You mean because we have a lot of discussion if Scotland is independent and then we change from a national program to an international program?
That's the one.
Okay. It's a kind of yes. It's a kind of yes and no answer. I think yes, we have all the potentials. Yes, the museum. If we talk about museums, but maybe in a different way, Eric, than you said. What I think is really unbelievable in the UK is that, again, is those potential in the collections. I mean, we have in the V&A 65,000 objects from India. It's not a question if it would be great to collaborate. I mean, it's there, we have to do it. And it's also a market, it's both. Yeah. So, honestly, I'm not a fan of cultural diplomacy, but I mean, in a certain way, this is business and it's politics at the same time, so one has to use that. That's one part of it. The other one, yes, I mean, we saw that this morning. Some of the major designers from Britain, they are already somewhere else. Most of them are in California, which is a kind of strange thing. But there's a potential of more networking, working closer together, having strategies that come from the cultural institution to the design industry. I think if you know more about each other, if there are more official strategies, working with the government, working with the Foreign Office, we could do it definitely better. But it doesn't mean that it's bad, don't get me wrong. But it's more individually based, it's some museums, and I mean the museums work very closely together, but anyhow, definitely we can do better. Talking about, because I'm always worried about being the only museums person here, I'm always worried about this Abu Dhabi effect and similar things. This is definitely not the future. And after years being very closely connected to the Emirates, I'm not sure if it will work in the end. I mean, you said it. I mean, several million visitors in an area where you have hardly a few million inhabitants. And there's not, it takes a while to fly in, it takes a while to be there. I think we have to be more, we have to work in a different scale and not creating British institutions on other parts of the world. It's more cooperations.
Absolutely.
And again, it's the, I would love to have the commercial sector, the business sector, and the cultural sector working closer together.
Martin, can I just want to respond. One of the things, you know, we always talk about visitors and guests to our facilities, but collections bring something else. They bring scholarship. Collections bring scholarship. And when you have at the V&A, at the Natural History Museum, at the British Museum, some of the finest scholars in the world concentrated, dealing with ancient civilizations all the way up to the present, when we talk with these nations, talk with these heads of states and ministers in countries around the world, the first thing we say to them, you can't buy culture. You have to create a network of scholarship within your own culture to teach the children how to value that culture. Because right now, the only people that value it are not here in these nations, right? They're all scholars at your museum, they're scholars in North America. And it is the hardest thing to get across, because somewhere in the past of the United Kingdom, there became a fascination with ancient cultures, and they started collecting. And collecting begets curating, and curating begets conveying and teaching, and that begets creativity. And that cycle, which is the best part of what leisure and entertainment and culture is about, has to begin in all the nations of the world, not just a handful.
Okay, now Miranda, you deal in a different sort of property, domestically here, but also around the world.
Yeah, I think it is changing. Certainly, we now have a situation where two of the biggest chains of aquariums are actually British companies, and they're expanding rapidly, not only in Europe, mainly in Europe, but also now starting into North America. So that influence and that design, aquarium design, is certainly moving out of the UK. However, as far as zoo designers are concerned, there has been a tendency for the UK, British zoos, to bring them in, a lot of them from the States and from abroad. But I think we're now seeing people like yourself who are taking the British designs abroad. So I think it is changing, and it certainly needs to change more. And we do need more homegrown designers who are not just doing excellent work within the UK, but also taking it abroad.
Interesting. We were nearly doing a project, weren't we, in Abu Dhabi? But obviously you were looking after, classically with your company, the operational expertise.
I love this question because this is why we're all here. This is what this week, this period, this 2012 is all about. This question allows me to do my flag waving for Britain is great, because the reality is the question states the fact that we do have huge intellectual property. We may have gathered it from elsewhere, we may have looked after it for a while for others, but we have that intellectual capital. And others look to us, they have looked to us, they still look to us. I've been privileged enough to go on a number of the UKTI missions abroad. Mission, it sounds James Bond-like, but that's what they are. They take our expertise out to places like China and to the Middle East, and it's absolutely awe-inspiring to see with what reverence our expertise in all of these areas is actually still held, other than perhaps with the exception of the States, who probably do feel as though they know what they're doing, with a pair of Mickey Mouse ears on at least. But our cultural expertise in terms of operations, design, fabrications, installers, we are held up as experts. There are the opportunities for us to take those expertise, or that expertise, abroad. And if this is a big flag waving, I'm going to ask for additional money here, but there are the opportunities for all of us to do that, and for other countries to ask for us to come, and we should all take that opportunity to exchange.
Bob, now I'm going to hold you back on this one, because the next question is right in your ballpark, and we do have time for this question. So the next question comes from Blair Parkin.
In case you hadn't gathered, I'm a technologist, so it's bound to go wrong. Panel. Technology, from the very first stone tools right through to the iPad, has always supported economic growth. But how much has technology changed human behavior, and how has this impacted the visitor attractions industry? And furthermore, what is the next big idea?
Bob, Sean Moven.
Thank you very much for lumbering me with that one. I think we can read a bit too much into, you know, the question of the change of behaviour. Undoubtedly, of course, there's been change in behaviour, but basically, we still remain human beings. We're not suddenly developing. I mean, there was a time when it was thought that everybody would be developing, you know, amazing thumbs because of the way that phones work. But now, of course, we're not having to do that anymore. You can just wave your hand over it. You don't have to develop thumb work. You can if you want to, but at one point it looked like we might have to develop new bits of anatomy to work technology. It's not true. We still remain the same people. And one of the points I made earlier, just going back to the simple thing about display design and the design ideas, there's huge similarities in what was done in the 1851 exhibition and what we do today. I have a talk, which some of you heard, where I show that they had interactive exhibits then. They had, you know, their take on the iPad was somewhat different, but some of the fundamental ideas were already there. So we're human beings, and we've been able to see how with progress in technology we can reinterpret ideas, but the fundamental idea has remained the same. Of course, behavior has been modified, but quite often for quite different reasons. I mean, for instance, for somebody of my age, the idea that you got taken to school in a 4x4 was a bit odd. One walked to school. These days, it's considered unsafe to walk to school. You have to be taken in a 4x4. So technology, what's happened there? There's a bad bit of human behavior has intercepted a piece of technology. And I'd like to think that that sort of thing is going to be very temporary. And therefore, I look much more to say, how can we exploit technology as it is to create beautiful things? The fact that we heard John Ives this morning explaining, I thought very well, how by breaking the rules, they were able to make a beautiful thing. I think the example of the Olympic cauldron was fantastic, where somebody looked quite differently at things and exploited technology in a completely different way, and that's really what we want to see. And I'm not a human behavior person at all. All I've enjoyed in my life is having fun, putting on a show. And I think what we need amongst all of us is this imagination to think up the new ideas and then find the technological solution, not impose technology the other way around, say, because we've got this technology, we must do this. Absolutely the wrong way around. And if anybody's got any good ideas, I think Blair would have as many good ideas as I would, is about what is the next big idea. Because what do we mean by the big idea? Clearly, when Disney started Disney World, in the mid-50s, they set off a fuse of amazing proportions. But of course, it's proved, in fact, that you can't actually replicate that all over the place. It just will only work with a critical mass of visitors. It only works for certain types of audiences, if you're quite frank about it. And it can't be everywhere. So it's no good saying, well, is there going to be a new Disneyland? Is there going to be a new sort of simulator or anything like that? In the end, it comes down to stories. Don't tell me about, what is the new technical idea. What is the new story idea? And I'll be all ears. I think that's really all I can say. And I think Blair would agree with me on that.
Very good. Juliana, I think you're nodding there, and I know you totally agree with that.
I was trying not to crack an in-joke, but any of you who've watched the series 2012 on television will perhaps remember the marvellous quote, which was from a marketing person, obviously, the future is going backwards. And actually, I think we've perhaps got to that point. Which is where technology has had such a major influence that I'm actually experiencing or finding people in my attractions, visitors, who just want to talk to somebody. They want to talk. They don't want to press a button. They don't want to use technology for technology's sake. They actually want to talk to another human being. So my big idea would be similar to yours, which is let's go back to actually telling good stories, interacting as human beings, and let the technology sit on the outside rather than actually drive it.
Now, Miranda, obviously we deal in this sector with naturalistic environments, but of course technology does play an important part.
Increasingly so, but I think what both of you have said is both very, very pertinent. I'd really like to add to what you've already said. We just don't have the evidence at the moment. We actually don't know. We're trying to do this in zoos now. We're trying to find out if people talking to the public actually does have more effect than a machine. And it may do, but at the moment we don't have the data to prove it. The museums, you're much better at collecting evidence than we are, and we're trying to improve at this. And my message is that we don't have the evidence, we don't know, and we need to collect the evidence.
Martin?
You mean the future in general for the museums, or what's the next gadget? I mean, if you talk about gadget, then I think it's the whole TV thing. Google TV, Apple TV, what we have now as website will be the moving image sooner or later, millions of moving images. I mean, part of the museum is the digital world, honestly. I mean, we see that in our public. And 2 weeks ago, I asked that lady who was Twittering and all those things. I mean, the hierarchy is, I think it's somewhere in India, then it's a city in South America, and then it's London. You know, I mean, it depends on the question, it depends on the topic. So we are everywhere at the same time, and I think that changed our perspective for museum completely. At the same time, I mean, the aura of the object is only in the British Museum or in the V&A or in the Tate, whatever it is. You have to travel all the way. And that will never change. That's the big asset. That's the great part of our collection, and we won't change that.
And to take us over the finishing line, Eric.
You know, the great thing about technology is it shortens the distance between the question and the answer. Our nieces, my nieces and nephews are growing up. I bought Apple computers for every one of them so I can have video conferences on every construction site I am around the world. They're growing up knowing that you can move blocks of buildings around like chess pieces with abandon, right? No fear about doing this. We pose questions to them all the time. We have little research projects with each one of them. And they have grown up knowing that they can go on and research and get answers instantly, where we had to troll through dusty books and musty old libraries. Everybody now can get access. So technology to me isn't about the technology, it's about the ability to encourage people to ask questions. And that's our business, right? That's what leisure and entertainment and culture is all about. Get them to have the courage to ask the questions and be there with ways that they can find their answers, and if they can't find the answers, they will create their own. And that will empower a generation unlike anything we have ever seen. It is absolutely the best of what we do, and we are the only industry that does that, by the way. We are the only ones that do it, and we are not doing it good enough. So it's time to get on with it. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a great thing to finish on. Oh, sorry, Bob.
So
yeah.
can I just add, really, I was going to make a similar but different point than Eric's just made, which I took the question literally at first about visitor experiences and so on. But I think the technology has enabled visitor attractions typically to operate much more efficiently. It opens up a much better operating regime. And we mustn't forget that technology isn't just about screens and things like that. It's all the other technologies that go with it in respect of lighting and sound and environment, aircon, boring things like that. But these are all important things for the operator because they're expense. And technology is making a big stride at the moment in potentially reducing these costs. And that's something we must look at as well. It's not just the show business stuff. It's also back of house. And I think that's quite important.
Absolutely.
An even better place to finish, because we started off by saying experience adds value. Now, you've heard from our guests, maybe, as I said before, an eclectic way of explaining how experience adds value. Maybe not in expected ways. I'm sure there are some expected ways. But anyway, we've overrun by 3 minutes, which is not bad. So I'd love to thank the panellists. So Martin Roth, Miranda Stevenson, Juliana Delaney, Robert Simpson, and Eric Kuhne.